Welcome back to Books and Bites. Today we're gonna be diving into the intriguing world of power dynamics with Robert Greene's The 48 Laws of Power.
Okay.
This book distills strategies for navigating power from history, philosophy, and even warfare.
Uh-huh.
It's a bit like a playbook for understanding how power operates, even if you don't necessarily agree with all the tactics.
Yeah, it's true. This book is a bit controversial, but that's what makes it so fascinating, I think. It challenges us to think about the nature of power and the often unspoken rules that govern human interaction.
Right, it's like peeking behind the curtain to see the mechanisms at play.
Yeah.
So let's start with Law 1, never outshine the master. This law is all about managing upwards, making sure you don't threaten your superiors.
Think of it this way. It's about strategically positioning yourself within a power structure.
Okay,
You can showcase your talents and abilities without making those above you feel insecure.
right.
Greene uses the example of Galileo, who dedicated his astronomical discoveries to powerful patrons like the Medicis. By doing so, he gained their support without overshadowing them.
That's a clever strategy. It's not about hiding your brilliance, but understanding that sometimes you need to present it strategically to gain favor and support. So how can someone apply this law in a modern context, say, in the workplace?
It's all about being mindful of office politics, right?
Yeah,
You can highlight your boss's achievements while showcasing your own contributions.
right.
It's about being a team player while still letting your talents shine through. Subtlety is key.
Makes sense. It's about finding that balance between highlighting your own skills and making sure those in power feel acknowledged and respected. Now on to Law 2. Never put too much trust in friends, learn to use enemies. This one sounds a bit ruthless, doesn't it?
It might seem that way at first glance, but the idea here is that former enemies, once won over, can be incredibly loyal allies. They have more to prove and are often more willing to go the extra mile to demonstrate their allegiance.
So it's about recognizing the shifting nature of relationships and how former rivals can become valuable assets. Could you give us an example of how this law played out in history?
Certainly. King Louis XI of France was a master at this. He strategically kept former enemies close, understanding their ambition could be redirected to serve him.
Interesting.
They were eager to prove their loyalty and became some of his most trusted advisors.
It makes you think about the dynamics of trust and loyalty and how they can shift depending on the circumstances. Okay, moving on to Law 3. Conceal your intentions. Why is it so important to keep people guessing about your true motives?
When you reveal your intentions too early, you give others the opportunity to obstruct or manipulate your plans.
Right.
By keeping them in the dark, you maintain an element of surprise and control.
So it's about being strategic and calculating in your approach, revealing your hand only when necessary. Could you give us an example of how someone successfully concealed their intentions?
Take Bismarck, for example. He was a master of this. He strategically manipulated European powers by concealing his true aim, German unification. He played his cards close to his chest, maneuvering his opponents into positions that ultimately served his grand plan.
That's fascinating. It's a reminder that sometimes the path to power involves a bit of deception and misdirection. Speaking of saying less, let's move on to Law 4. Always say less than necessary. Why is brevity so powerful?
In a world overflowing with information and opinions, words can easily lose their impact. By choosing your words carefully and speaking only when you have something truly valuable to say, you increase the weight of your words and command more attention.
So it's about being deliberate and impactful with your communication, choosing quality over quantity. Is there a historical figure who exemplifies this law particularly well?
Think of the ancient Spartan warriors, renowned for their brevity and silence. Their words carried weight precisely because they were so rare and carefully chosen. They understood that silence can be a powerful tool, creating an aura of mystery and strength.
That's a great point. It's a reminder that sometimes the most powerful statements are the ones left unsaid. Now on to Law 5. So much depends on reputation. Guard it with your life. Why is reputation so crucial, especially when it comes to power?
Reputation is the foundation of power. It's the perception others have of you, and it can either bolster or undermine your authority. One slip-up, one moment of weakness, and your carefully crafted image can crumble, leaving you vulnerable.
So it's about actively managing your public image and being mindful of how your actions and words will be perceived by others. Is there an example from history that illustrates the importance of safeguarding one's reputation?
Consider Confucius, whose entire philosophy centered around cultivating virtue and building an unassailable reputation.
Okay.
He understood that a strong moral foundation and a reputation for integrity were essential for gaining the trust and respect of others.
It's interesting how this law applies to our modern world, especially with the rise of social media. One ill-advised post or comment can damage a reputation that took years to build. Now let's move on to Law 6, court attention at all costs. This seems a bit contradictory to the previous law about saying less. Can you clarify this for us?
This law isn't about being loud or obnoxious. It's about strategically using attention to your advantage.
Okay.
Power thrives on visibility. Whether through bold actions, unique style, or impactful words, you need to stand out from the crowd and capture the attention of those you seek to influence.
So it's about being memorable and making a lasting impression. It's not just about what you do, but also how you present yourself. Is there a historical figure who embodies this law well?
Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, understood the power of spectacle. His court at Versailles was a dazzling display of wealth and power designed to captivate and awe. He knew how to command attention and project an image of absolute authority.
That's a great example. It shows that power isn't just about substance, but also about style and presentation. It's about creating an aura that draws people in. Now let's move on to Law 7, which shifts our focus a bit. Get others to do the work for you, but always take the credit. This one sounds a bit ethically ambiguous. Could you elaborate?
This law is about leveraging the skills and talents of others to achieve your goals. It's about recognizing that you don't have to do everything yourself to succeed. However, it's crucial to be mindful of ethical considerations.
Okay.
While delegating tasks is smart, taking credit for someone else's work is dishonest and can damage your reputation in the long run.
So it's about finding that balance between utilizing the strengths of others and ensuring that everyone receives due credit for their contributions. Could you give us an example of how this law played out in history, for better or worse?
A controversial example is Thomas Edison, who often took credit for the innovations of his employees, notably Nikola Tesla. While Edison was a brilliant inventor, his approach to taking credit for the work of others raises ethical questions about intellectual property and fairness.
It's a reminder that while delegation is essential for success, it's crucial to practice ethical leadership and acknowledge the contributions of those who help you achieve your goals. Now let's move on to Law 8. Make other people come to you. Use bait if necessary. What does it mean to use bait in this context?
This law is about positioning yourself strategically and creating circumstances that draw people to you. The bait can be anything that piques their interest, a unique opportunity, valuable information, or even the perception of scarcity. Think of it like setting a trap, creating a scenario where people feel compelled to seek you out.
So it's about creating leverage and making yourself the person others need to approach to get what they want. Can you give us a historical example of how someone successfully used this strategy?
Napoleon Bonaparte, a master military strategist, often lured his enemies onto battlegrounds that gave him a tactical advantage. He would create scenarios that appeared favorable to his opponents, drawing them into a trap where he could exploit their weaknesses.
That's a brilliant example of using bait to manipulate a situation to your advantage. It highlights the importance of strategic thinking and understanding your opponent's motivations. Let's move on to Law 9. Win through your actions, never through argument. Why is action more powerful than words, especially when it comes to persuasion?
Arguments often lead to defensiveness and resistance, creating unnecessary conflict and hindering progress.
Right.
Actions, on the other hand, speak for themselves. They demonstrate competence, integrity, and commitment in a way that words simply cannot.
So it's about letting your results speak for themselves, showing rather than telling. Is there a historical figure who embodies this law well?
Queen Elizabeth I, known for her political prowess, rarely engaged in public disputes. Her silence projected strength and authority. She understood that actions, particularly decisive ones, often carried more weight than words.
That's an interesting perspective. It's a reminder that sometimes the most powerful form of communication is simply doing what needs to be done. Now let's move on to Law 10. Infection. Avoid the unhappy and unlucky. This one sounds a bit harsh. Could you clarify?
It's not about being callous or abandoning those in need. It's about protecting your own mental and emotional well-being.
Okay.
Negativity can be contagious, and surrounding yourself with people who are chronically unhappy or pessimistic can drain your energy and hinder your own success.
So it's about being mindful of the company you keep and recognizing that the people you surround yourself with can influence your own mindset and outlook. Is there a historical example that illustrates the dangers of associating with the unhappy and unlucky?
While historical examples of this might be difficult to pinpoint, the principle remains relevant. Think of it this way. If you're constantly surrounded by people who complain and focus on the negative, it's likely to affect your own perspective. It's about seeking out relationships that uplift and inspire you rather than those that bring you down.
That's a great point. It's about recognizing that your social circle can have a profound impact on your own well-being and success. Now let's move on to Law 11, which takes a bit of a strategic turn. Learn to keep people dependent on you. This sounds like it could easily cross the line into manipulation. Could you elaborate?
This law is about making yourself indispensable.
Okay.
It's about cultivating a unique set of skills, knowledge, or resources that others rely on. This doesn't mean manipulating people into a state of helplessness. It's about positioning yourself as a valuable asset, someone whose contributions are essential to the success of others.
So it's about becoming the go-to person, the one with the expertise or connections that others need to achieve their goals. Can you give us an example of someone who successfully applied this law?
Catherine de' Medici, a powerful figure in 16th century France, wielded immense influence not through brute force but by making herself indispensable to the French court. She cultivated a vast network of alliances and dependencies, ensuring that everyone needed her favor to maintain their own positions of power.
That's a brilliant example of how strategic networking and relationship building can create a web of interdependence that strengthens your own position. Now let's move on to Law 12. Use selective honesty and generosity to disarm your victim. This one sounds particularly Machiavellian. Could you explain?
This law emphasizes the strategic use of honesty and generosity.
Okay.
It's not about being deceitful, but recognizing that even honesty can be used as a tool to gain an advantage.
Right.
Small acts of kindness and carefully chosen truths can lower people's defenses, making them more receptive to your influence.
So it's about using honesty and generosity strategically, not as inherent virtues, but as tools to achieve a specific aim. Could you provide an example of how someone employed this law, for better or for worse?
A rather infamous example is the con artist Yellow Kid Weil. He was a master at using small truths to build trust and then exploiting that trust for larger deceptions. He understood the power of appearing genuine and using selective honesty to manipulate his victims.
It's a reminder that even the most seemingly positive qualities can be twisted for manipulative purposes. It highlights the importance of discernment and recognizing that appearances can be deceiving. Now let's move on to Law 13. When asking for help, appeal to people's self-interest, never to their mercy or gratitude. This seems to go against the grain of how we're often taught to ask for help.
This law is about understanding human motivation. People are more likely to help you if they see a benefit to themselves. Instead of appealing to their compassion or sense of obligation, frame your request in a way that aligns with their own interests and goals.
So it's about finding common ground and highlighting the mutual benefits of helping you. Could you give us an example of how this law was successfully applied?
Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, was a master of this. He rallied support for his conquests not by demanding loyalty, but by promising his followers wealth, land, and power in exchange for their allegiance.
That's a great example of how appealing to self-interest can be a powerful motivator. It's about recognizing that everyone has their own agendas, and finding ways to align those agendas with your own can lead to greater success. Now let's move on to Law 14, which takes a bit of a clandestine turn. Pose as a friend, work as a spy. This sounds a bit like something out of a spy novel. Could you elaborate?
This law is about the importance of gathering information strategically. While it doesn't advocate for outright deception, it emphasizes the need to be observant and discerning in your interactions. It's about reading between the lines, paying attention to subtle cues, and gathering intelligence that can give you an advantage.
So it's about being aware of your surroundings and using your powers of observation to gain insights that others might miss. Could you provide an example of how someone effectively employed this strategy?
Talleyrand, a French diplomat known for his cutting, was a master of gathering information.
Okay.
He used his charm and social connections to extract valuable intelligence from both allies and rivals, often through seemingly casual conversations and social gatherings.
That's a fascinating example of how social intelligence and the art of conversation can be used to gather information and gain a strategic edge. Now let's move on to Law 15, crush your enemy totally. This one sounds quite ruthless. Could you explain the rationale behind such a seemingly extreme approach?
This law is the most controversial and should be applied with extreme caution. Greene argues that leaving an enemy even slightly wounded can create a future threat. However, this doesn't necessarily advocate for physical violence or annihilation. It can also refer to completely dismantling someone's power base, discrediting their ideas, or neutralizing their influence so they can no longer pose a threat.
So it's about recognizing that sometimes half measures can backfire, and that a decisive victory is necessary to prevent future conflict. Is there an example from history that illustrates this principle?
Genghis Khan, the Mongol conqueror, understood the importance of crushing his enemies utterly.
Right.
His brutal tactics, while morally reprehensible, were undeniably effective in consolidating his power and establishing a vast empire.
It's a reminder that power struggles can be incredibly complex, and that sometimes the most effective strategies, even if morally questionable, can have a profound impact on the course of history. Now let's move on to Law 16, which takes a different approach. Use absence to increase respect and honor. This seems counterintuitive. Should you explain?
This law is based on the principle of scarcity. When something is readily available, its value diminishes. The same applies to people.
Okay.
When you're constantly present and available, people may take you for granted. By strategically withdrawing and making yourself less accessible, you create a sense of mystery and allure, increasing your perceived value.
So it's about being intentional with your time and energy, creating a sense of demand by making yourself less readily available. Can you give us an example of how someone successfully employed this strategy?
Coco Chanel, the iconic fashion designer, famously withdrew from the fashion world for 15 years, only to return with even greater acclaim and influence. Her absence created a sense of anticipation and made her designs even more desirable.
That's a great example of how stepping back strategically can actually enhance your position in the long run. It's a reminder that sometimes less is more. Now let's move on to Law 17. Keep others in suspense. Cultivate an air of unpredictability. Why is it important to keep people guessing?
Predictability can lead to complacency and a loss of control. By being unpredictable and keeping people on their toes, you maintain a sense of intrigue and keep them from becoming too comfortable or taking you for granted.
So it's about maintaining an element of surprise and preventing others from anticipating or manipulating your moves. Can you give us a historical example of someone who successfully employed this strategy?
Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, was notorious for his unpredictable behavior and penchant for paranoia. This kept his inner circle constantly on edge, never knowing what to respect or who to trust.
Right.
While his methods were often brutal, his unpredictability was a key factor in consolidating his power.
It's a chilling reminder that unpredictability can be a powerful tool for good or for evil. Now let's move on to Law 18. Do not build fortresses to protect yourself. Isolation is dangerous. Why is isolation so detrimental, especially when it comes to power?
Isolation breeds paranoia and makes you vulnerable to manipulation. Power thrives on connections, alliances, and information flow. By isolating yourself, you cut off access to these vital resources, leaving yourself exposed to potential threats and undermining your ability to influence events.
So it's about recognizing the interconnectedness of power and understanding that strength comes from collaboration and alliances. Is there a historical figure who exemplifies the dangers of isolation?
Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, retreated into isolation during the early 20th century, ignoring the growing social unrest and political turmoil that ultimately led to his downfall and the collapse of the Romanov dynasty.
That's a sobering example of how withdrawing from the world and ignoring the changing tides can have disastrous consequences. Now let's move on to Law 19. Know who you're dealing with. Do not offend the wrong person. This seems like a fairly obvious piece of advice. Why is it so important?
It's about understanding the dynamics of power and recognizing that not everyone is equal in terms of influence and authority. Offending someone with the power to harm you can have serious repercussions.
So it's about being discerning in your interactions and choosing your battles wisely, recognizing that some people have more power to affect your life than others. Could you give us an example of someone who learned this lesson the hard way?
Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France during the French Revolution, infamously failed to understand the changing social dynamics and made enemies of powerful figures who ultimately contributed to her downfall.
It's a reminder that even those in positions of apparent power can misjudge their relationships and underestimate the influence of those they perceive as less powerful. Now let's move on to Law 20, which seems to encourage a detached approach. Do not commit to anyone. Why is it so important to maintain a degree of independence?
Committing too readily to any one person, faction, or ideology can limit your flexibility and make you vulnerable to manipulation. By remaining neutral and keeping your options open, you maintain the freedom to maneuver and adapt to changing circumstances.
So it's about avoiding entangling alliances that could restrict your freedom of action and limit your ability to pursue your own interests. Can you give us a historical example of someone who successfully navigated the complexities of commitment and neutrality?
Queen Elizabeth I was a master of this. She skillfully navigated the treacherous waters of European politics, playing rivals against each other and avoiding firm alliances that could drag her into costly conflicts.
Right.
Her ability to remain detached and adaptable allowed her to maintain her power and preserve England's independence.
That's a brilliant example of how strategic non-commitment can be a powerful tool for navigating complex political landscapes and preserving one's autonomy. Now let's move on to Law 21, which seems to advocate for a bit of deception. Play a sucker to catch a sucker, seem dumber than your mark. This one sounds a bit like a con artist trick. Could you explain the logic behind this strategy?
This law is about the power of underestimation. By appearing less intelligent or capable than you actually are, You can lull your opponent into a false sense of security, giving you the element of surprise when you make your move.
So it's about playing the long game, allowing your opponent to underestimate you so you can capitalize on their misjudgment. Can you give us an example of how this law was successfully employed?
P.T. Barnum, the legendary showman, was a master of this. He often played up his folksy persona, appearing less sophisticated than he actually was.
Right.
This disarmed critics and allowed him to outmaneuver his competitors.
That's a fascinating example. It shows that sometimes playing the fool can be a clever way to gain an advantage and outsmart those who underestimate you. Now let's move on to Law 22, which seems to advocate for a counterintuitive approach. Use the surrender tactic. Transform weakness into power. How can surrendering ever be a path to power?
Surrender doesn't always mean defeat. Sometimes yielding can be a strategic maneuver that allows you to gain a tactical advantage or preserve your resources for a more opportune moment.
So it's about recognizing that sometimes retreating or giving ground can be a strategic move that ultimately leads to greater strength in the long run. Can you give us a historical example of how this tactic was successfully employed?
Consider the example of the ancient Roman general Fabius Maximus, known as the Delayer. He famously avoided direct confrontation with Hannibal's powerful Carthaginian army, instead employing a strategy of attrition, harassing Hannibal's supply lines and gradually weakening his forces. This patient and seemingly passive approach ultimately led to Rome's victory in the Second Punic War.
That's a great example of how strategic retreat and a willingness to adapt to circumstances can turn apparent weakness into ultimate victory. Now let's move on to Law 23, which emphasizes focus. Concentrate your forces. Why is it so important to concentrate your resources and efforts?
Spreading your resources too thin can lead to mediocrity and weaken your impact. By focusing your efforts on a specific goal or area of expertise, you maximize your effectiveness and increase your chances of achieving dominance.
So it's about identifying your core strengths and channeling your energy into areas where you can excel, rather than trying to be all things to all people. Can you give us an example of someone who mastered this principle?
John D. Rockefeller, the oil tycoon, amassed his vast fortune by concentrating his forces. He focused on building a dominant position in the refining sector, strategically acquiring competitors, and streamlining his operations to achieve unprecedented efficiency and control.
That's a powerful example of how focus and specialization can lead to extraordinary success. Now let's move on to Law 24. Play the perfect courtier. This seems like a throwback to a bygone era. Is this law still relevant in the modern world?
Absolutely. The principles of courtly behavior, grace, diplomacy, tact, and social intelligence are timeless and essential for navigating any social or professional setting. It's about understanding the unspoken rules and etiquette that govern human interaction and using them to your advantage.
So it's about being aware of social dynamics and adapting your behavior to make a positive impression and build strong relationships. Could you give us an example of someone who embodies this law?
Benjamin Franklin, the American statesman and diplomat, was a master of courtly behavior. He navigated the complex world of European politics with charm, wit, and a keen understanding of human nature, winning over allies and influencing decisions that helped secure American independence.
That's a great example of how social intelligence and diplomatic skills can be incredibly powerful tools for achieving your goals. Now let's move on to Law 25. Recreate yourself. This one sounds quite transformative. Could you elaborate?
This law is about the power of reinvention. In a world that's constantly changing, clinging to outdated identities can be limiting. By embracing change and evolving with the times, you stay relevant and maintain your edge.
So it's about recognizing that growth and adaptation are essential for long-term success, and being willing to shed old personas and embrace new ones that better serve your goals. Can you give us an example of someone who mastered the art of reinvention?
David Bowie, the legendary musician, was a master of reinvention. Throughout his career, he constantly transformed his image and sound, pushing boundaries and challenging expectations.
Right.
This constant evolution kept him at the forefront of popular culture and ensured his lasting legacy.
That's a brilliant example of how embracing change and constantly reinventing yourself can lead to creative breakthroughs and sustained success.
You see how these first 25 laws of power provide valuable insights into how power dynamics operate? Whether we like it or not, these principles are at play in our everyday lives.
Absolutely, and we've only just scratched the surface. We'll delve into the remaining laws in Part 2 of our deep dive into Robert Greene's The 48 Laws of Power.
That's right. Join us next time as we continue to explore the often subtle, sometimes ruthless, but always fascinating world of power.
Don't forget to grab a copy of Robert Greene's The 48 Laws of Power from the link in the episode description, and be sure to subscribe to Books and Bites for more insightful explorations of thought-provoking books.
Okay.
We'll see you next time. Welcome back to Books and Bites. We're continuing our deep dive into Robert Greene's The 48 Laws of Power. Last time we covered the first 25 laws, exploring strategies for navigating power dynamics, from managing your superiors to understanding the importance of reputation and cultivating strategic alliances.
Right.
Now we'll delve into the remaining 23 laws, uncovering even more insights into the complex and often subtle workings of power.
These next laws delve deeper into the psychology of power, exploring tactics for manipulating perceptions, creating compelling narratives, and mastering the art of timing and adaptability. Get ready for some intriguing and perhaps even unsettling insights.
Okay, let's jump right in with Law 26, keep your hands clean. This sounds like it's all about maintaining a spotless reputation, but I suspect there's more to it than that.
You're right, it goes beyond simply being ethical. This law emphasizes the strategic use of scapegoats and the importance of distancing yourself from blame. It's about recognizing that even the most powerful individuals can be brought down by scandal, and that protecting your reputation often requires making difficult choices, even if it means sacrificing others to preserve your own image.
So it's about being strategic and even ruthless when necessary to maintain a clean image and protect your position of power. Can you give us an example of how this law played out in history?
Richard Nixon's downfall during the Watergate scandal is a prime example. While Nixon himself may not have been directly involved in the break-in, his attempts to cover it up and shift blame to others ultimately led to his resignation.
Right.
This illustrates the dangers of trying to maintain a facade of innocence when your hands are dirty. It's often better to cut your losses and distance yourself from a scandal before it engulfs you entirely.
That's a stark reminder that power is often a precarious thing, and that even the most powerful individuals can fall from grace if they fail to protect their reputations. Now let's move on to Law 27, play on people's need to believe to create a cult-like following. This sounds a bit manipulative, doesn't it?
It can be, and it's important to be aware of the ethical implications of this law. However, it highlights a fundamental truth about human nature. We all crave meaning, purpose, and a sense of belonging. Those who can tap into these deep-seated desires and offer a compelling vision or ideology can amass incredible power.
So it's about understanding people's aspirations and fears, and then offering them a narrative that resonates with their deepest needs. Can you give us an example of someone who successfully, albeit controversially, employed this strategy?
While it's a dark example, Adolf Hitler's rise to power in Nazi Germany illustrates the potent combination of a charismatic leader, a compelling ideology, and a population desperate for hope and a sense of national identity. By offering a scapegoat for Germany's economic woes and painting a vision of a glorious future, Hitler was able to create a cult-like following that blindly supported his agenda.
That's a chilling reminder of how powerful a shared narrative can be, especially when it's fueled by fear, anger, and a yearning for something greater than oneself. Now let's move on to Law 28, which seems to advocate for a more decisive approach. Enter action with boldness. Why is boldness so crucial when it comes to power?
Hesitation and indecisiveness can be fatal in a power struggle. Bold action commands attention, inspires confidence, and creates momentum. When you act decisively, you project an aura of strength and determination that can sway others to your side and make your vision a reality.
So it's about seizing opportunities, taking calculated risks, and not being afraid to make a move when the time is right. Can you give us an example of someone who embodied this boldness?
Julius Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon River is a classic example of bold action.
Okay.
By defying the Roman Senate and marching his army into Italy, Caesar committed to a path of no return, ultimately leading to his seizure of power and the transformation of Rome from a republic to an empire. This audacious move changed the course of history and cemented Caesar's place as one of the most powerful figures in the ancient world.
That's a powerful example of how a single, decisive act can alter the course of events and propel someone to the pinnacle of power. Now let's move on to Law 29, which takes a more strategic approach. Plan all the way to the end. Why is it so important to think long-term and anticipate potential obstacles?
Without a clear vision of your ultimate goal and a plan for overcoming obstacles, you're likely to get sidetracked, lose momentum, and fail to achieve your full potential.
Right.
It's like setting out on a journey without a map or a destination in mind. You might wander aimlessly and never reach your desired destination.
So it's about being proactive and strategic, anticipating challenges and developing contingency plans to ensure your success. Can you give us an example of someone who excelled at long-term planning?
Otto von Bismarck, the mastermind behind the unification of Germany, was a master strategist. He carefully cultivated alliances, manipulated his rivals, and meticulously planned his moves to achieve his ultimate goal of creating a powerful German state.
Right.
His long-term vision and strategic brilliance transformed the political landscape of Europe.
That's a great example of how planning and foresight can lead to remarkable achievements. Now let's move on to Law 30, which seems to emphasize appearances. Make your accomplishments seem effortless. Why is it important to make things look easy, even when they're not?
When you make your achievements appear effortless, you project an aura of mastery and inspire awe in others. People are more likely to follow those who seem to possess a natural talent or an easy path to success.
So it's about cultivating an image of competence and grace, even if it takes a lot of hard work behind the scenes. Can you give us an example of someone who mastered this art of effortless accomplishment?
Mozart, the musical prodigy, is a classic example.
Okay.
While his genius was undeniable, Mozart downplayed the years of rigorous practice and dedication that fueled his musical virtuosity. His ability to make his compositions seem effortlessly brilliant contributed to his legendary status.
That's an interesting perspective. It's a reminder that perception is often as important as reality, and that presenting yourself as effortlessly skilled can enhance your authority and influence. Now let's move on to Law 31. Control the options, get others to play with the cards you deal. This sounds a bit like a magician's trick. Could you explain?
This law is about framing choices in a way that benefits you. By subtly limiting the options available to others, you can steer them towards the outcome you desire, even if they believe they're making their own decisions freely.
So it's about creating an illusion of choice while subtly manipulating the decision-making process. Can you give us an example of how this law was applied?
Henry Kissinger, the renowned diplomat, was a master of this tactic. During negotiations, he would present his opponents with a limited set of options, all of which ultimately served his own interests. By skillfully framing the choices, he could steer the outcome in his favor without appearing overtly controlling.
That's a subtle but powerful strategy. It highlights the importance of understanding how choices are presented and recognizing when you're being subtly influenced. Now let's move on to Law 32. Play to people's fantasies. This sounds like it's all about marketing and persuasion. Could you elaborate?
You're right, this law is at the heart of effective marketing and persuasion. People are more easily swayed by emotions and desires than by logic and reason. By appealing to their fantasies, their hopes, dreams, and aspirations, you can create a powerful connection and make them more receptive to your message.
So it's about understanding people's deep-seated desires and crafting a narrative that taps into those emotions. Can you give us an example of how this law has been used effectively?
Think of any successful advertising campaign. Whether it's selling a car, a perfume, or a political ideology, the most effective campaigns tap into our desires for status, belonging, security, or adventure. They create aspirational images and stories that make us believe that buying their product or supporting their cause will bring us closer to fulfilling those desires.
That's a great example. It shows how understanding human psychology and crafting narratives that resonate with our deepest desires can be incredibly persuasive. Now let's move on to Law 33, which seems to advocate for a more ruthless approach. Discover each man's thumbscrew. This sounds a bit ominous. What does it mean?
This law is about understanding people's weaknesses and vulnerabilities. It's about recognizing that everyone has their pressure points, their insecurities, fears, or secrets that can be exploited to gain leverage. However, it's crucial to acknowledge the ethical implications of this law. Using someone's weaknesses against them can be incredibly damaging and should be approached with extreme caution.
So it's about recognizing that even the most seemingly confident individuals have their vulnerabilities, and that understanding those vulnerabilities can give you an edge in a power struggle. Can you give us a historical example of how this law was applied?
J. Edgar Hoover, the longtime director of the FBI, amassed immense power by collecting compromising information on politicians and other influential figures. He used this information to exert pressure and maintain his position of authority. While his tactics were often ethically questionable, they illustrate the power of exploiting weaknesses to gain leverage.
That's a chilling example of how knowledge can be weaponized and used to control others. It highlights the importance of safeguarding your own secrets and recognizing when someone might be trying to exploit your vulnerabilities. Now let's move on to Law 34, which seems to emphasize self-belief. Be royal in your own fashion. Act like a king to be treated like one. This sounds like it's all about confidence and self-presentation. Could you elaborate?
You're right. This law is about projecting an aura of authority and deserving respect, regardless of your actual social standing. It's about carrying yourself with confidence, setting high standards, and commanding attention through your presence and demeanor.
So it's about believing in yourself and acting in a way that inspires confidence and respect in others. Can you give us an example of someone who embodied this royal demeanor.
Consider the example of Coco Chanel.
Okay.
Despite her humble beginnings, Chanel carried herself with an air of royalty, revolutionizing the fashion industry with her bold designs and unwavering self-belief. Her confidence and charisma helped her establish a fashion empire and become a global icon.
That's a great example of how self-assurance and a commanding presence can elevate your status and influence, even if you don't come from a position of privilege. Now let's move on to Law 35. Master the art of timing. Why is timing so crucial when it comes to power?
Timing is everything.
Right.
Acting too early can lead to failure. Waiting too long can mean missing an opportunity. Recognizing the opportune moment when circumstances align in your favor and seizing it decisively is crucial for maximizing your impact and achieving your goals.
So it's about being patient, observant, and recognizing when the time is right to make your move. Can you give us an example of someone who mastered this art of timing?
Nelson Mandela's release from prison and his subsequent rise to become the first president of a democratic South Africa is a testament to the power of timing. After decades of imprisonment, Mandela emerged as a symbol of hope and reconciliation.
Right.
His patience, resilience, and ability to seize the right moment to negotiate a peaceful transition to democracy transformed a nation.
That's an inspiring example of how timing, coupled with vision and leadership, can create lasting change. Now let's move on to Law 36. Disdain things you cannot have. Ignoring them is the best revenge. This sounds like it's about letting go and moving on. Could you elaborate?
This law is about the futility of dwelling on things that are beyond your control. Obsessing over what you can't have only breeds resentment and bitterness. By accepting what is and focusing your energy on attainable goals, you free yourself from negativity and empower yourself to move forward.
So it's about choosing your battles wisely and accepting that sometimes the most strategic move is to simply let go and redirect your energy towards more productive pursuits. Can you give us an example of someone who embodied this principle?
The Stoic philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome emphasized the importance of accepting what is beyond our control. By focusing on what they could influence their own thoughts and actions, they achieved a sense of inner peace and tranquility, even in the face of adversity. This philosophy is still relevant today as it reminds us that dwelling on negativity only hinders our own growth and happiness.
That's a valuable lesson in emotional intelligence and the power of choosing a positive mindset. Now let's move on to Law 37, which seems to emphasize the power of perception. Create compelling spectacles. Why are spectacles so effective in influencing people?
Spectacles appeal to our emotions and create lasting impressions. They bypass our rational minds and tap into our primal instincts, making us more receptive to the message being conveyed.
Right.
In a world saturated with information, spectacles cut through the noise and capture our attention.
So it's about creating memorable experiences that engage our senses and leave a lasting impact. Can you give us an example of someone who effectively used spectacles to enhance their power?
Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple, was a master of creating compelling spectacles. His product launches were legendary, carefully orchestrated events that generated immense hype and excitement. He understood the power of showmanship and used it to captivate audiences and create a loyal following.
That's a great example. It shows how even the most technologically advanced products can benefit from a touch of theatricality and a well-crafted narrative. Now let's move on to Law 38, which seems to advocate for conformity. Think as you like, but behave like others. This sounds a bit contradictory to the idea of being bold and assertive. Could you clarify?
This law is about recognizing the importance of social conformity, at least outwardly.
Okay.
While it's essential to maintain your own beliefs and values, openly challenging social norms or flaunting your unconventionality can make you a target and undermine your influence.
So it's about being strategic in how you present yourself and recognizing that sometimes blending in can be more advantageous than standing out. Can you give us an example of someone who successfully navigated the balance between individuality and conformity?
Leonardo da Vinci, a Renaissance polymath, was a brilliant artist, inventor, and scientist. However, he was careful to conceal some of his more radical ideas, especially those that challenged religious dogma. This allowed him to operate within the constraints of his time, pursuing his intellectual passions while avoiding persecution.
That's an interesting example. It shows that sometimes it's necessary to conform outwardly to protect yourself and your ideas while still pursuing your goals behind the scenes. Now let's move on to Law 39, stir up waters to catch fish. This sounds a bit mischievous. What does it mean?
This law is about recognizing that sometimes it's necessary to create a bit of chaos to achieve your goals.
Okay.
By disrupting the status quo, you can create opportunities that wouldn't otherwise exist.
So it's about being a catalyst for change, shaking things up and using the resulting turmoil to your advantage. Can you give us an example of how someone successfully employed this strategy?
Margaret Thatcher, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, was known as the Iron Lady for her bold and often controversial policies.
Okay.
She challenged the established order, shook up the British economy, and transformed the political landscape, leaving a lasting impact on her country and the world.
That's a great example of how disrupting the status quo can lead to profound change. It's a reminder that sometimes progress requires challenging conventional wisdom and shaking things up a bit. Now let's move on to Law 40, Despise the free lunch. This sounds like it's about self-reliance and independence. Could you elaborate?
You're right. This law emphasizes the importance of maintaining your independence and avoiding entanglements that could compromise your position.
Right.
Accepting favors or gifts creates obligations that can limit your freedom of action. It's about recognizing that true power comes from self-reliance and not being beholden to anyone.
So it's about being cautious and discerning in your dealings with others, recognizing that even seemingly generous offers can come with strings attached. Can you give us an example of someone who embodied this principle of independence?
Consider the example of George Washington, the first president of the United States. He was known for his integrity and his refusal to accept gifts or favors that could compromise his position or influence his decisions. This commitment to independence helped establish a precedent of ethical leadership in the young nation.
That's an inspiring example of how integrity and self-reliance can solidify one's power and inspire trust in others. Now let's move on to Law 41. Avoid stepping into a great man's shoes. This seems like it's about the challenges of following in the footsteps of a legend. Did you elaborate?
It's about the pressure and expectations that come with trying to fill the void left by a powerful predecessor. Often it's better to forge your own path and establish your own identity rather than trying to emulate someone who came before you.
So it's about recognizing the importance of originality and carving out your own niche rather than trying to live up to someone else's legacy. Can you give us an example of someone who faced this challenge?
After Abraham Lincoln's assassination, his successor, Andrew Johnson, struggled to live up to the legacy of the revered president. Johnson's policies and leadership style were often at odds with the public's expectations, leading to a tumultuous presidency and ultimately his impeachment by the House of Representatives.
That's a cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to fill a void that is too large and the importance of establishing your own identity as a leader. Now let's move on to Law 42. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will scatter. This sounds a bit ruthless. What's the strategy behind this law?
This law emphasizes the importance of targeting the leader or the most influential figure in a group or organization. By neutralizing the leader, you effectively dismantle the entire structure, leaving the followers without direction or purpose.
So it's about recognizing the hierarchical nature of power and understanding that taking out the head can often be the most efficient way to dismantle an entire system. Can you give us a historical example of how this strategy was employed?
The Spanish conquistadors' conquest of the Inca Empire in the 16th century illustrates this principle. By capturing the Inca Emperor Atahualpa Francisco Pizarro, effectively neutralized the Inca leadership, throwing the empire into chaos and making it easier to conquer.
That's a dramatic example of how targeting the leader can lead to the swift collapse of an entire civilization. It's a reminder of the importance of strong leadership and the potential consequences of a power vacuum. Now let's move on to Law 43, which takes a more persuasive approach. Work on the hearts and minds of others. Why is it so important to win over people's emotions, not just their minds?
Logic and reason are important, but emotions drive our actions. By appealing to people's hearts, their hopes, fears, and aspirations, you create a deeper connection and inspire a more lasting sense of loyalty.
So it's about understanding the power of emotional intelligence and recognizing that true persuasion involves connecting with people on a deeper level, not just presenting them with facts and arguments. Can you give us an example of someone who mastered this art of emotional persuasion?
Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights leader, was a master of appealing to both hearts and minds. His powerful speeches combined eloquent arguments for equality with passionate appeals to justice and human dignity. His ability to inspire and motivate millions was rooted in his deep understanding of human emotions and his ability to connect with his audience on a visceral level.
That's a powerful example of how emotional intelligence and the ability to inspire hope and compassion can be incredibly powerful tools for driving social change. Now let's move on to Law 44. Disarm and infuriate with the mirror effect. This sounds a bit psychological. What's the strategy behind this law?
This law is about using your opponent's toxins against them. By mirroring their behavior, you can expose their hypocrisy, disarm their aggression, and throw them off balance.
So it's about recognizing that sometimes the best defense is a good offense, and that using your opponent's own strategies against them could be a powerful way to gain the upper hand. Can you give us an example of how this tactic was employed effectively?
Gandhi's strategy of nonviolent resistance during India's struggle for independence from British rule is a brilliant example of the mirror effect. By peacefully resisting unjust laws and enduring the brutality of British suppression, Gandhi exposed the hypocrisy of British claims of moral superiority and rallied international support for India's cause.
That's a powerful example of how mirroring an opponent's behavior can expose their weaknesses and shift the balance of power. Now let's move on to Law 45, which seems to advocate for a more gradual approach to change. Preach the need for change, but never reform too much at once. Why is it important to implement change gradually?
Radical change often leads to resistance and instability. People are creatures of habit and tend to resist sudden or drastic shifts in their lives.
Right.
By introducing change gradually and allowing people time to adapt, you can minimize resistance and ensure a smoother transition.
So it's about recognizing that change is a process, not an event, and that patience and strategic planning are crucial for achieving lasting transformation. Can you give us an example of how this principle was applied?
The Meiji Restoration in 19th century Japan is a remarkable example of gradual but transformative change.
Okay.
Rather than attempting to overthrow the existing social order entirely, the Meiji leaders introduced a series of reforms that modernized Japan's economy, military, and government while preserving key aspects of Japanese culture and tradition.
That's a fascinating example of how gradual change can lead to profound transformation, blending tradition with innovation. Now let's move on to Law 46. Never appear too perfect. This seems counterintuitive. Why isn't it sometimes advantageous to show your flaws?
Perfection can be intimidating and alienating. People are naturally drawn to those who seem relatable and human. By revealing your imperfections, you make yourself more approachable and create a sense of authenticity.
So it's about recognizing that vulnerability can actually be a strength, and that allowing people to see your human side can enhance your appeal and make you more likable. Can you give us an example of someone who embraced this principle?
Franklin D. Roosevelt, the American president during the Great Depression and World War II, carefully concealed his disability from polio, understanding that public perception of strength and vitality was crucial for maintaining morale during challenging times.
Right.
However, his ability to connect with the American people on a personal level despite his personal struggles contributed to his immense popularity and enduring legacy.
That's a great example of how authenticity and vulnerability can strengthen a leader's connection with the people. Now let's move on to Law 47. Do not go past the mark you aimed for. In victory, learn when to stop. Why is it important to recognize when you've achieved your goals and avoid overreaching?
Success can be intoxicating, and it's easy to get carried away by your own ambition. However, overreaching and pushing your luck can lead to hubris and ultimately your downfall. Knowing when to stop when you've achieved your objective is crucial for preserving your gains and ensuring long-term success.
So it's about recognizing that sometimes the wisest move is to walk away from the table a winner rather than risking everything by trying to achieve even more. Can you give us a historical example of someone who failed to heed this advice?
Napoleon Bonaparte's ambition ultimately led to his downfall. His relentless pursuit of conquest led him to overextend his forces and make strategic blunders, culminating in his disastrous invasion of Russia and his eventual defeat at Waterloo.
That's a classic example of how unchecked ambition and a failure to recognize limits can lead to ruin. Now let's move on to the final law, Law 48. Assume Formlessness. This sounds a bit abstract. Could you explain what it means?
This law is about adaptability and the importance of being fluid and responsive to changing circumstances.
Okay.
Just as water adapts to its container, so too must we be willing to adapt our strategies, our approaches, and even our identities to navigate the ever-changing currents of life.
So it's about recognizing that rigidity is a weakness, and that flexibility and a willingness to adapt are essential for surviving and thriving in a world that's constantly in flux. Can you give us an example of someone who embodied this principle of formlessness?
Bruce Lee, the martial arts legend, famously said, "Be like water." He believed that the key to success in combat and in life was to be adaptable, to flow around obstacles, and to strike when the opportunity presented itself.
That's a powerful analogy that encapsulates the essence of this law. It's a reminder that we must be flexible, adaptable, and always ready to evolve to navigate the complexities of life and achieve our goals. We've journeyed through all 48 laws of power, dissecting strategies from history, philosophy, and even warfare. We've seen how these laws can be applied to subtly influence others, navigate complex social situations, and achieve ambitious goals. But as we wrap up our deep dive, I'm curious about your thoughts on the ethical implications of these laws.
Yeah, it's a question that lingers throughout the book. Greene doesn't shy away from presenting laws that can be perceived as manipulative or even ruthless.
Right.
However, he emphasizes that power itself is neither inherently good nor evil. It's a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for constructive or destructive purposes.
Makes sense. It's like fire. It can provide warmth and cook food, but it can also burn and destroy. It's the intention and the way it's wielded that determine its impact.
Exactly. The ethical considerations lie not in the laws themselves, but in the individual's choices about how to apply them. Someone might use Law 3, conceal your intentions, to manipulate and deceive,
Right.
while another might use it to strategically navigate a complex negotiation and achieve a mutually beneficial outcome.
So the responsibility lies with the individual to use this knowledge wisely and ethically. It's a reminder that awareness of these laws is not an endorsement of their unethical application.
Exactly. The book is more of a guide to understanding the mechanics of power, not a set of moral commandments. It's up to each reader to grapple with the ethical implications and decide how they want to navigate the world of power dynamics.
As we've discussed these laws, I've been struck by how they can be applied in various aspects of life, from personal relationships to career advancement and even social movements.
Absolutely. While the book draws heavily on historical examples, these laws are timeless and applicable to countless situations. Understanding them can provide valuable insights into human behavior and the often unspoken dynamics of power that shape our interactions.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most valuable takeaways from this deep dive. Recognizing that these power dynamics are at play all around us, whether we're conscious of them or not.
It's true. Once you start to see these laws in action, it's like a light bulb goes off. You begin to understand the motivations behind people's actions and the often subtle ways in which power is exerted and negotiated.
It's like having a secret decoder ring that allows you to decipher the hidden messages in our everyday interactions.
Precisely. And while this knowledge can be used for personal gain, it can also be incredibly empowering. It can help you protect yourself from manipulation, assert your own influence, and even become a more effective advocate for the causes you believe in.
I think that's a really important point. This book isn't just for aspiring CEOs or Machiavellian masterminds. It's for anyone who wants to understand the dynamics of human interaction and navigate the world with greater awareness and agency.
Exactly. Whether you're negotiating a raise, navigating a difficult relationship, or trying to make a difference in your community, understanding these laws can give you an edge and help you achieve your goals.
So as we wrap up, I'm curious, what's one piece of advice you would give to our listeners based on what we've learned from the 48 Laws of Power?
I would encourage everyone to be a student of human nature. Observe the world around you. Pay attention to the subtle ways in which power is exerted and negotiated. And think critically about the motivations behind people's actions. The more you understand about human behavior and the dynamics of power, the better equipped you'll be to navigate the complexities of life and achieve your own goals.
That's great advice. It's a reminder that this book isn't just about acquiring power, but about understanding it. And with understanding comes the ability to make more informed and empowered choices.
Well said. And remember, knowledge is power, but wisdom lies in using that power responsibly and ethically.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the 48 Laws of Power. We hope you found it as insightful and thought-provoking as we have. And if you're interested in learning more, we encourage you to pick up a copy of Robert Greene's book, which you can find a link to in the episode description. Be sure to subscribe to Books and Bites for more deep dives into fascinating and thought-provoking books. Until next time.